The air in the grand refectory of the Starfall Academy was a meticulously balanced cocktail of gases, designed for the comfort of the 47 species that comprised the current cadet class. It tasted like sterile metal and ozone to Elias Thorne, a flavor he'd come to associate with his own profound isolation. He sat alone at a four-person table, a solitary human island in a sea of chittering, vibrating, and resonating alien life. The nearest occupied table was a calculated 5 meters away. When he had first entered, the low hum of conversation had faltered, a wave of silence spreading from the door like a ripple in a pond. Now the noise had returned, but it was different, a self-conscious murmur that carefully skirted his personal space. He methodically consumed his nutrient paste, a gray substance engineered to be universally palatable and nutritionally complete. It tasted of nothing, which was a mercy. He focused on the mechanics of eating, a simple, repeatable action that grounded him in the overwhelming strangeness of his environment. The walls of the refectory were not walls at all, but shimmering fields of contained energy that showed a real-time view of the nebulae swirling outside the station's viewport. Blues and purples bled into one another, dotted with the diamond-sharp points of distant stars. It was a beauty so vast and impersonal it bordered on terrifying. Across the room, Kalen Javar held court. Clad in the burnished obsidian and gold armor of the Valter Imperium, ceremonial yet fully functional, he was a monument to aristocratic arrogance. The Valter were feline bipeds, powerfully built, with sleek black fur and eyes like molten gold. They saw themselves as the galaxy's natural leaders, their entire culture built upon a rigid code of martial honor that had served them for millennia. Kalen gestured with a gauntleted hand, his deep, resonant voice easily carrying across the room as he recounted a tale of some daring maneuver in the simulators. His companions, a mix of bulky, insected Cathar and stone-skinned Gorgons, laughed at the appropriate moments, their gazes occasionally flicking towards Thorne with undisguised contempt. Thorne felt a different gaze on him, something less hostile and more inquisitive. He didn't need to look to know it was Cadet Lyra. He'd learned to recognize the subtle pressure of her attention, a phantom touch on the edge of his consciousness. She was a Xylan, a species so slender and graceful they seemed almost to float. Their primary mode of communication was verbal, but it was always underscored by a constant, low-level empathic broadcast. To other Xylans, it was a rich tapestry of shared emotion. To outsiders, it was a faint whisper of feeling. To Thorne, whose mind was a fortress of disciplined thought, she had once confessed that trying to read him was like listening to a quiet but powerful storm behind a very thick wall. He finished his paste, rose, and placed the tray in the reclamation unit. As he turned, he saw Lyra detaching herself from her own group and drifting towards him, her iridescent skin shimmering under the ambient light. The cadets near her path shuffled subtly away, creating a clear lane between them, as if they were afraid of contamination by association. "Cadet Thorne," she said, her voice a soft, melodic chime. Her large, liquid black eyes were wide with a familiar mix of fear and curiosity. He could feel the faint tremor of her apprehension. "Cadet Lyra," he replied, his tone even and neutral. He learned early that his voice, a standard Terran baritone, was perceived by most species as unnervingly low and flat. I was listening to Cadet Javar," she began, her slender fingers twisting together. "He speaks of war as if it is a glorious performance. For the Valter it is," Thorne said. "Their code is everything. It dictates who they fight, and how their enemies are expected to behave. It's a beautifully ordered, ritualized system." Lyra tilted her head. "You sound as if you admire it." The empathic undertone was one of surprise. "I admire its elegance." "As a historical curiosity," Thorne clarified, a distinction that was utterly lost on everyone but perhaps her. "A system that rigid is brittle. It cannot adapt. It can only break." He saw the thought form in her mind before she spoke it, a flicker of cold dread. Like the G-Vorn hegemony, the name hung in the air between them. It had come up that morning in Instructor Zorgan's strategic doctrine class. Zorgan, a Cathar whose scaled hide was the color of ancient jade and whose voice was like rocks grinding together, had projected a holomap of the G-Vorn's spectacular collapse 5 centuries prior. "Cadet Javar," Zorgan had rumbled, his unblinking eyes sweeping the lecture hall. "Your analysis of the G-Vorn's failure," Kalen had risen, his armor scraping softly against the floor. "A failure of will, Instructor. Their admirals showed cowardice in the face of the Outer Rim Coalition." They refused to commit their grand fleets to a decisive, honor-bound engagement. They scattered their forces, attempting to defend everything, and in doing so, defended nothing. A textbook case of tactical indiscipline. A murmur of agreement went through the hall. It was the accepted wisdom, the version taught in every academy from here to the Galactic core. Zorgan's gaze had then settled on Thorn. Cadet Thorn. The human perspective. The hall went silent. Every eye turned to him. Thorn remained seated, his posture relaxed. The G-Vorn didn't fall because of tactical indiscipline, instructor. They fell because their ambition outpaced their logistics. He let the words sit there. He could feel the confusion in the room, the dismissal. They had a 400-year supply of refined stellar plasma and the largest fleet in the quadrant. Kalen scoffed. Their logistics were peerless. They had fuel and ships, Thorn countered, his voice still quiet, but they didn't have food. Their outer colonies, the ones that fed their core worlds, were connected by shipping lanes that were 10 light-years long. The hegemony was focused on the glory of its warships, but it was hollow. The Outer Rim Coalition never engaged the G-Vorn fleet. They didn't have to. They used fast raiders to hit the G-Vorn's agri-worlds and their slow, unarmed food freighters. Within 3 standard years, the core worlds were starving. The grand fleets had full tanks but empty bellies. They mutinied. The hegemony didn't fall to an enemy fleet. It devoured itself. The silence that followed was heavy and hostile. He had taken a story of glorious war and reduced it to a matter of interplanetary crop shipments. He had stripped it of its honor. Kalen's golden eyes narrowed. A butcher's calculus, fitting for a human. It is the same thinking that led your people to victory against the Rigel. He spat the name like a curse. You didn't defeat their fleets. You hurled asteroids at their industrial worlds from the cover of a nebula. You murdered billions of civilians from a distance, then waited for their war machine to rust. You call that victory. We call it barbarism. Now, standing in the refectory, Lyra looked at him, her empathic sense picking up the cold, clinical truth behind his classroom analysis. You believe that, she whispered. You truly see conflict as an equation of resources. Everything is a resource, Lyra, Thorn said softly. Morale, political will, food, water, information. A warship is simply one of the least efficient ways to project power. Kalen sees a fleet of majestic Valter battle cruisers. I see the thousands of beings required to crew them, the planetary industrial base required to build them, the complex supply chain of fuel, munitions, and life support required to maintain them. The fleet isn't the weapon. The system that supports the fleet is the weapon, and it's a much bigger, much softer target. He excused himself and walked away, leaving her standing in the middle of the refectory. He felt her fear, but beneath it, something new was blooming, a dawning, horrified understanding. He walked to the zero-G training sphere for his afternoon maneuvering exercise. His assigned partner, a feathered avian named Chur, literally recoiled when Thorn offered a hand to stabilize their rotation, flaring his wings and fluttering to the far side of the sphere. Thorn completed the exercise alone, his movements precise and efficient, the solitude a familiar cloak. He knew what they called him in their hushed whispers, the Butcher of Ryle, after the human general who had orchestrated that infamous victory. They saw him not as a cadet, but as the living embodiment of humanity's most monstrous act of war. And Elias Thorn, in the cold, quiet depths of his own mind, did absolutely nothing to discourage the notion. It was a useful reputation to have, a shield, and perhaps one day a weapon. Humanity, after all, had learned its lessons in a much harder school than this pristine, orderly academy. The unification wars on Earth had not been clashes of noble fleets in the void. They had been centuries of grinding, desperate slaughter in mud and blood and irradiated dust. They had been wars of sabotage, of assassination, of engineered plagues and infrastructure collapse. Humanity had nearly annihilated itself, and in doing so, had learned a terrible, profound truth. The most effective way to win a war was to make your enemy forget about the battlefield and focus on the fact that his children were starving. It was a lesson Thorn had studied his entire life. He was not just a student of history. He was a student of atrocity, viewing humanity's darkest chapters as its most valuable textbooks. He was not here to make friends. He was here to show the galaxy that while they were playing a game of kings and castles, humanity had long since mastered the art of tearing the board apart. His performance in the Academy's core curriculum did little to change their perception of him. In Starship Command simulations, where cadets were expected to execute elegant, decisive fleet maneuvers, Thorn was decidedly average. He followed doctrine, maintained formations, but lacked the intuitive flair that marked cadets like Kalen Javar. He could quote the energy output of a Class IV plasma cannon, but struggled with the finer points of modulating shield harmonics under fire. It reinforced the stereotype Kalen so eagerly promoted. The human was a primitive, a creature of brute force and simplistic thinking, completely out of his depth in the sophisticated arena of modern interstellar warfare. But in other, less glamorous classes, a different picture emerged. In planetary survival, a simulation that dropped cadets onto hostile worlds with minimal equipment, Thorne excelled. While others died of exotic bacterial infections or were hunted by native predators, Thorne thrived. He stripped his gear for parts, built crude but effective shelters, identified edible flora through painstaking trial and error, and demonstrated a capacity for endurance that bordered on inhuman. He once spent 3 weeks of simulated time evading capture by hostiles, not by fighting them, but by systematically poisoning their water sources and collapsing their cave shelters, turning their own environment against them. The final report noted he had survived, but deemed his methods ethically questionable. His studies of unconventional warfare and historical attrition, he was not just a student, he was a savant. He submitted papers that were chilling in their clarity. 1. An analysis of the Silicate Swarm's century-long war against the Galactic Concord argued that the Concord's eventual victory was a demographic accident, not a strategic one. They had simply outbred the slower-producing silicates. His conclusion was stark. Any species that cannot replace its losses faster than its enemy can inflict them is already extinct. The war is merely a matter of formalizing the math. Instructor Zorgan had given him the highest possible mark, along with a private summons. Your mind is a strange and unsettling place, Cadet Thorne, the old Cathar had rumbled, his office filled with ancient, unreadable star charts. You see patterns others ignore. You look at a civilization and you do not see its art, its philosophy, or its glory. You see its vulnerabilities, its pressure points. Isn't that the purpose of a military officer, instructor? Thorne asked, for some. The Valter believe the purpose of an officer is to lead a glorious charge. The Xylans believe it is to negotiate a lasting peace. You seem to believe the purpose of an officer is to find the precise lever that, when pulled, causes the entire enemy structure to collapse upon itself with the least possible expenditure of your own resources. Zorgan leaned forward, his massive head casting a shadow over the desk. It is an effective philosophy. It is also one that has led to more genocides than any other in galactic history. The harassment from Kalen and his cohort, meanwhile, graduated from sneers to sabotage. Before a crucial gunnery exam, Thorne arrived at his console to find his primary targeting database wiped. The simulation was set to begin in 5 minutes. There was no time to report it without forfeiting the exam. Kalen, 2 consoles down, watched him with a smug grin. Thorne didn't panic. He didn't even frown. He simply took a breath and began manually inputting targeting solutions based on the raw telemetry data streaming from the ship's sensors. It was slow, archaic work, like doing long division by hand in an age of quantum computers. His first few shots were wide. The instructors noted his poor performance. But as the simulation progressed, Thorne began to internalize the rhythms of the enemy ships, the drift of their evasive maneuvers. He started leading his targets not with the aid of a predictive algorithm, but with raw intuition honed by a deep understanding of physics and desperation. His shots began to connect. First a disabling blow to an engine, then a direct hit on a shield generator. He didn't get a high score, but he passed. Later, reviewing the security logs on a public terminal, he found the digital footprints of the Valter cadet who had deleted his file. He didn't report him. Instead, he noted the cadet's sloppiness. The next day, that same Valter cadet found himself locked out of the mess hall replicators, his meal privileges inexplicably transferred to a sanitation drone on Deck 7. It took the Valter 3 hours of humiliating bureaucracy to fix it. Kalen knew Thorne was responsible, but there was no proof. There was only the unnerving reality that the primitive had outmaneuvered him in a digital space he was supposed to dominate. The human was a ghost, leaving no tracks, only consequences. The breaking point came, as Thorne knew it must, in a class on the Articles of Honorable Warfare. It was Kalen's domain, a subject he lived and breathed. He stood before the class at Instructor Zorgan's invitation and delivered an impassioned oration on the sanctity of the duel, the glory of a warrior's death, and the nobility of ship-to-ship combat. War is the ultimate test of a species' spirit. he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. It is a crucible that burns away weakness and reveals the true strength of one's honor. To die in glorious battle, your name sung by generations to come, is a fate far greater than a long life of peaceful obscurity. The articles are not mere rules, they are a sacred covenant that separates us from mindless, sat down to a wave of appreciative murmurs. His philosophy was the bedrock of the assembled galactic powers. It was comforting. It was civilized. Zorgan let the moment settle before his gravelly voice filled the room. A compelling perspective, Cadet Javar. Cadet Thorn, the articles were ratified by the first conquered 2 millennia before humanity achieved spaceflight. From your unique historical vantage point, what is the Terran view on the concept of honor in war? The air crackled with anticipation. This was the confrontation everyone had been waiting for. Thorn felt Lyra's empathic presence spike with anxiety. He rose slowly, his simple gray cadet uniform a stark contrast to Kalen's ornate armor. He looked not at Kalen but at Zorgan, his expression unreadable. "Victory is the only honor in war," he said, his voice level and devoid of emotion. "How you achieve it is irrelevant to the dead." A collective gasp went through the room. It was blasphemy. It was the public confession of everything they feared him to be. Kalen shot to his feet, his face a mask of incandescent rage. His honor, his culture, his entire worldview had been dismissed as irrelevant. "Sacrilege," he roared, his voice echoing in the chamber. "You speak with the tongue of a soulless savage. You would drag us all down into your species, blood-soaked mud. You think your butcher's calculus is strategy. I will show you what true strategy is. I will show you the power of the Valter way." He pointed a gauntleted finger at Thorn, a finger that trembled with fury. "I, Kalen of the House of Javar, challenge you, Elias Thorn of Earth, to a full-scale Dominion simulation. Your doctrine against mine, your barbarism against Valter honor. Here, before the entire Academy, let us see which philosophy endures." A Dominion simulation was the Academy's ultimate test, a week-long, fully immersive war game that had broken lesser cadets. It was a formal, binding challenge. To refuse was to admit cowardice and accept expulsion. The entire room, cadets, instructors, even Zorgan, held its breath. All eyes were on the lone human. Thorn's expression did not change. He held Kalen's furious gaze for a long moment, a silence that stretched into an eternity. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "I agree." 2 words landed with the force of a detonating warhead. They were not defiant. They were not angry. They were a simple statement of fact, a promise of something terrible to come. In that moment, Lyra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's life support. The quiet storm in Thorn's mind had just broken its containment. The parameters for the Dominion simulation were set by Instructor Zorgan, his impartiality beyond question. 2 identical forces. Blue Force commanded by Cadet Kalen Javar. Red Force commanded by Cadet Elias Thorn. Each was granted a home star system containing 1 Class M capital planet, 3 resource-rich moons, a dense asteroid belt, and a large gas giant with its own ring system. The forces themselves were mirror images, a balanced fleet of 20 warships, including 2 capital-class dreadnoughts, supported by a network of mining outposts, communication relays, and industrial fabricators. The objectives, however, were subtly, crucially different. Kalen's objective, as commander of Blue Force, was simple and direct, befitting a Valter: achieve strategic conquest of the Red Force capital planet, Solara Prime. Thorn's objective for Red Force was more esoteric: force the unconditional surrender of Blue Force command. One sought to capture a piece of territory, the other sought to break a will. The simulation went live, and the observation deck filled with cadets and faculty, their faces illuminated by the giant holographic display that showed the 2 star systems side by side. Kalen's opening move was a masterpiece of Valter doctrine. It was beautiful, it was terrifying, it was exactly what everyone expected. His entire fleet, all 20 ships, consolidated into a single, magnificent armada. Formed into a perfect spearhead formation with the 2 dreadnoughts at its heart, the Blue Force executed a flawless hyperspace jump, emerging into the Red Force system with a dazzling flash of cerulean light. They were a moving city of gunmetal and gold, bristling with energy cannons and missile pods, a declaration of overwhelming power. True to his code, Kalen broadcast his intentions on all open channels. "This is Commander Kalen Javar of the Blue Force Fleet. My target is the orbital defense grid of Solara Prime. I will commence my honorable assault in 2 standard hours." Meet me in battle and die with glory, or cower and be crushed, the observers murmured in appreciation. It was bold, honorable, and powerful. The raw might on display was breathtaking. They looked to the holographic display of the Red System, expecting Thorn to muster his own fleet into a defensive line to meet this glorious charge with a desperate, doomed defense. But Thorn's fleet did nothing. The 20 icons representing his warships did not consolidate. They did not form up over Solara Prime. One by one, they simply winked out. Their transponders went dead. Their energy signatures vanished. Within 10 minutes of Kalen's grand arrival, the Red Force fleet had ceased to exist. The system was silent, empty. On the observation deck, confusion reigned. "Is it a sensor malfunction?" one cadet asked. "He's hiding," another scoffed. "The coward is hiding his fleet." Kalen, in his command simulation pod, let out a snarl of contempt. The human was refusing to fight. He was denying the Valter their glorious battle. It was the ultimate insult. Furious but unshaken, he ordered his fleet to proceed. They began their majestic, powerful advance through the empty system, a predator stalking through a deserted forest. Instructor Zorgan watched the display, his old reptilian eyes betraying nothing. Beside him, Lyra felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She tried to get an empathic read on Thorn, but his mental presence was quieter than ever. It was the placid surface of a deep, cold ocean, and she knew that miles below, something massive and patient was beginning to move. The first pinprick came 5 hours into Kalen's inexorable advance. A single, insignificant icon on the logistics overlay of the Blue Force command table turned from green to red. Freighter BF-734, fuel transport status, unknown. Kalen barely noticed. A single freighter. Probably a minor engine malfunction. He was focused on the prize, the capital planet. An hour later, another notification. A remote mining outpost on one of the system's moons, responsible for refining the rare metals needed for dreadnought ammunition, went silent. Its life support readings flatlined. No distress call, no debris. It was just gone. Then a communications relay on the far side of the system, the one that guaranteed a stable link back to his home base, was suddenly destroyed. Not disabled, but obliterated. Kalen's fleet was halfway to Solara Prime, and it had not seen a single enemy warship. Yet it was bleeding. Thorn had enacted the Terran doctrine. His fleet wasn't gone. It had become the system itself. His 20 ships had broken into 10 autonomous pairs, wolf packs running dark and silent. They were nestled in the static noise of the gas giant's rings, powered down in the sensor shadows of hollowed-out asteroids, drifting in the silent cold between orbits. They were ghosts, and they were not hunting Kalen's dreadnoughts. They were hunting his supply chain. They targeted the slow, the unarmed, the undefended. A water tanker here. A repair drone depot there. Each attack was a tiny cut, insignificant on its own, but they were relentless, perfectly timed, and surgically precise. Kalen's majestic fleet was still a potent weapon, but its logistical support was beginning to hemorrhage. His fuel reserves were no longer being replenished. His ammunition stocks were slowly, almost imperceptibly, dwindling. He was a great beast, strong and proud, dying from 1,000 tiny bites he couldn't even see. Kalen grew enraged. This wasn't war, this was pest control. He was a lion being harassed by gnats. "Find them," he roared at his sub-commanders. "Sweep the system. I want that coward's command ship." And that's when Thorn began the second phase of his strategy. Psychological warfare. One of Kalen's patrols finally cornered and disabled a small Red Force corvette that had been a little too bold. When the Blue Force boarding party entered the ship's bridge, they found it empty, the crew having evacuated via escape pods. But the ship's communication system was active, playing a single audio file on a loop. It was a recording from ancient Earth. A deep, authoritative voice spoke over a crackling broadcast. "We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own." The recording of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds was meaningless to the Valter, but its tone, the calm, narrative description of an invisible, overwhelming invasion, was deeply unsettling. It planted a seed of paranoia. On the next disabled ship they found, the audio log was different. It was just a sequence of numbers, read in a flat, monotone female voice. A numbers station, a relic of old Earth's Cold War, a method for communicating with spies in deep cover. It was gibberish, but it sounded like code. It implied a hidden layer to the conflict they couldn't comprehend. The third ship contained readings from a human philosopher general named Sun Tzu. "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." Kalen's crews, steeped in a tradition of open challenges and glorious combat, this was maddening, it was dishonorable, it was terrifying. Their enemy was unseen, his methods bizarre and alien. They started seeing phantom sensor readings in the asteroid belt. Morale began to fray. The Valter Code had prepared them for a glorious death, but it had not prepared them for a war of whispers and shadows. Desperate for a real fight, a target he could finally hit, Kalen fell for Thorne's final gambit. Thorne allowed a single, larger energy signature to appear, a cruiser, seemingly acting as a command and control ship, at the edge of the gas giant's gravity well. It was bait. Consumed by his need to restore honor and crush the cowardly human, Kalen diverted 3/4 of his fleet, including one of his precious dreadnoughts, to hunt this phantom. He would corner it, destroy it, and hang its scalp on his banner. His great armada, the pride of the Valter, raced away from their primary objective on a wild goose chase. With Kalen's main force distracted, Thorne's wolf packs, silent for hours, finally reconsolidated. 15 of his ships, a formidable fleet in their own right, emerged from the shadows. But they didn't move to intercept Kalen's hunting party. They didn't race to reinforce Solara Prime. They executed a single, coordinated hyperspace jump. They appeared in the Blue Force home system, in high orbit of Kalen Javar's capital planet. A world named Valor's Crest, the cadets on the observation deck gasped. This was it, the counterattack, the final battle. Thorne would bombard Kalen's home world, a taste of his own medicine, but the Red Force fleet did not open fire. The orbital bombardment cannons remained silent. That was not the human way. That was too crude, too direct. It was a strategy for breaking things. Thorne's goal was to break a system. His ships launched swarms of precision munitions. They were not aimed at military targets or population centers. The first wave struck Valor's Crest's primary power distribution grid. Key substations across the planet exploded, not with the fury of a nuclear strike, but with the quiet efficiency of a surgeon's cut. The planet's lights flickered and died. The second wave targeted the planet's water purification and atmospheric processing plants. Again, no major casualties, just critical infrastructure rendered inert. Within hours, the planet's environment would begin to turn toxic. The third wave was not a physical weapon. It was a massive cyber warfare assault. Thorne's forces seized control of the planet's financial data networks, freezing all assets and corrupting economic records. They simultaneously hijacked the primary communication network, blanketing the planet with an information warfare campaign of terrifying sophistication. Artificial news reports announced a new, deadly plague sweeping through the capital city. Faked messages, perfectly mimicking the voice of Kalen's second-in-command, were broadcast to the planetary militia, ordering them to hoard food and abandon their posts, claiming Kalen's fleet had been destroyed and that he had fled the system. Panic, carefully seeded and expertly cultivated, did what no orbital bombardment ever could. It turned the society against itself. Riots broke out over food. The local government, unable to communicate or access resources, collapsed. Kalen Javar, having finally cornered and destroyed the bait ship, a hollowed-out cruiser on autopilot, returned triumphantly to the Red System, only to find it as empty as before. It was then that his own system's status light on his command console began to flash a frantic, desperate red. He watched in horror as the data streamed in. His home world, the heart of his power, was in complete systemic collapse. His industry was offline. His population was in revolt against a phantom threat. His glorious fleet, which hadn't suffered a single scratch on its capital ships in a major engagement, was now a useless, fuel-starved liability with no industrial base to support it, no home to return to. The war was over. He had not lost, he had been undone. The main holographic display in the Academy observation deck flickered. The simulation had ended. A single message, sent from Red Force Command to Blue Force Command just before the system shut down, now filled the screen. It was one word: yield. A profound, tomb-like silence descended upon the observation deck. Cadets from 46 different species stared at the screen, their faces a mixture of confusion, shock, and a dawning, primal fear. They had just witnessed a form of warfare completely alien to their understanding. It was a war without battlefields, without honor, without glory. It was a war waged not against ships or soldiers, but against the very idea of a functioning civilization. Kalen Javar stumbled out of his simulation pod, his face pale beneath his dark fur. His golden eyes were wide with a vacant, uncomprehending horror. He had been prepared to die in a blaze of glory. He was not prepared to be rendered irrelevant. His code, his honor, his entire identity as a warrior had been systematically dismantled and shown to be a fragile luxury. He was publicly and professionally shattered. Instructor Zorgan's gravelly voice cut through the silence, calm and chillingly analytical. "Observe," he said, his gaze sweeping over the stunned cadets. "And learn." Cadet Javar fought as a warrior. He sought to defeat a fleet in honorable combat. His strategy was sound, his execution flawless, according to millennia of established doctrine. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Cadet Thorne, however, understood he was not fighting a fleet. He was fighting a system. He did not target ships. He targeted the intricate web of logistics, trust, and order that allows a society to wage war. He understood that a dreadnought with no ammunition is a museum piece. A soldier with no food is a refugee, and a population that fears its own government is a weapon turned against itself. He did not destroy ships. He destroyed the ability to make war. Zorgan turned his ancient eyes toward the solitary figure of Elias Thorne, who stood near the edge of the observation deck, watching the swirling nebulae outside. "Remember this lesson," Zorgan concluded. "It may be the most important you ever learn." Stood alone, as always, but the space around him was different now. It was no longer a space of simple ostracism. It was a space of profound, terrified respect. His reputation as a brutal savage had been vaporized. In its place was something new, something far more complex and unsettling. He was a savant of collapse, a grandmaster of a game no one else in the galaxy had even known they were playing. Lyra approached him slowly. The fear she felt was still there, a cold knot in her core, but it was now mingled with something else, a deep and unsettling awe. She looked at the quiet human, at his calm profile against the backdrop of the stars, and finally understood. The galaxy had spent millennia perfecting the art of the duel, crafting beautiful, honorable rules for a deadly game. And then humanity had arrived, having learned from its own near extinction that the only winning move was to knock over the table, burn the rulebook, and dismantle the house in which the game was being played. She finally understood the quiet storm she'd sensed within him. It wasn't the chaos of a predator. It was the cold, patient, terrifyingly logical calculus of the ultimate survivor, and the galaxy would never be the same.